All right, so let's talk about the First Great Awakening. It is a religious movement. That's the first thing you need to know. Please always put that in your brain. The First Great Awakening is a religious movement. Obviously, you know by now, religion had a strong influence in colonial life. Churches were not just a religious center, they're a social center. And so if you want to grab the colonists' attention, you grab them in their churches. Now, please notice also that we're down the road in time. We're in the 1730s and 40s. We're 100 years down the road now. We're past the Pilgrims. We're past a lot of things. We're past the Navigation Acts. We're in the 1730s and 40s now. Also, you need to know this man's name, Jonathan Edwards. He's really important. There's a little picture of him, and somebody did a portrait of him, and this is what he looks like up there in the corner, Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was one of the most important figures in the First Great Awakening. And you're probably thinking, well, Mrs. Butts, what is so important about a religious movement? Well, you'll see in just a second. All right, another important person was George Whitefield. All right, this Great Awakening inspires the formation of new churches. And if you'll please look at the third bullet point, there's an emphasis on a personal relationship with God. Up until this point, people felt that the only way they could speak to God, and I realize that this is, you're probably thinking this is a ridiculous, small thing, Mrs. Butts, but it really isn't. They felt that the only way they could speak to God was through a minister or a preacher or a priest. That was the only way that they could communicate with God. But no more. These people, George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, preached that you yourself can have a relationship with God. You don't need anybody in between you and him. You go straight to God. It's a whole new way of thinking about religion. And if you think about it, it truly is a whole new way of thinking about religion. So no longer is there someone in between you and the Supreme Being. You go right straight to him, and that's a big deal for colonists and for everyone. So we're talking about the Great Awakening only in relationship to what's going on in the colonies. But this movement was going on in Europe too. So it was affecting people in Europe and in the colonies. Please also notice the last bullet point. It gives the colonists a starting point for questioning the absolute authority of the king. Because here's the thinking. If I am equal in God's eyes, if all of us are equal in God's eyes, we all have equal access to God, then why does the king have so much authority over me? Why then am I so beholden to this person? Why is he so much better than me? So because of this Great Awakening, it made people start to question absolute authority of monarchs. And not just in the United States or what would become the United States. Other places too. The United States, the colonies, was the very first people who started to do something about it. But this religious movement led to revolutions in other places too. So it is important, even though it's a religious movement, and we're talking mostly a political upheaval later on, the religious movement has something to do with it. Okay, so make a distinguishment between the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment. Great Awakening, religion. Enlightenment is science. I always try to think about the Enlightenment as, sometimes in cartoons, you see a little guy, he's thinking, and a light bulb goes off in his head, he's thinking. Well, the Enlightenment is science. And during the same time as the Great Awakening, there was a huge movement in science. And these were huge, important thinkers. I mean, people like Isaac Newton and Benjamin Franklin are occupying the same time frame on the globe. I mean, great, important thinkers. And these people spread the idea that knowledge and reason and science can improve society. We don't have to just keep on going down the same road we've been going down. We can actually think of new ways to do things. And we should think of new ways to do things. And that was, again, it was novel. It was new. It was, wow. It was a light bulb going off. And it promoted the idea of, again, third bullet point, very important, a belief in equality and the idea of popular government. And that popular doesn't mean like, oh, it's the latest fad. It means people, government by the people. Because again, these thinkers began thinking, and they thought, well, why are the people not responsible for their own government? people like Locke, people like Voltaire. All these folks started thinking about this, and they're like, well, this doesn't make any sense what's been going on all these years. These are important people to know, names to know. Jonathan Locke is responsible for the concepts of life, liberty, and property, those being your basic human rights. You have the right to life, you have the right to liberty, people cannot throw you in jail just willy-nilly, and you have the right to your property. The king cannot take away your property. Montesquieu, now I don't know that name, look at the spelling of that, doesn't that drive you insane? Okay, Montesquieu, he's from France, so these people are all European mostly, okay? Other than Franklin, they're all European. But their ideas made it across the Atlantic Ocean, and the colonists took it to heart. So it helps play a role in starting the revolution. So Montesquieu gives us the idea of separation of powers as a model of government. So why do we have to know him? Well, obviously, when we study how the government in the United States gets set up once we become a country, he's the person that gives us the idea of an executive branch, a legislative branch, a judicial branch. He's the guy who came up with it way back when. Voltaire speaks out against religious intolerance. He's the man who gives us the idea that, you know what? We should not be saying that only Catholics can live here, that only Anglicans can live here. We should all try to get along because, oh, let's see, aren't we all God's children? That was his point. Franklin was important because he was an American physicist and inventor. He was brilliant, and we, of course, are going to talk a lot more about Franklin later on. And again, these people are all occupying the same time period, which is, that's why they call it the Enlightenment, because these people are all working together at the same time. Newton, theory of gravity, of course, you'll study about him in science. Galileo, the novel idea that the planets revolve around the sun, and of course, he was thrown in jail because of that, because all of the religious leaders of the time said, oh, no, that can't possibly be, and that's such a terrible idea, we'll throw you in jail. But these people are all folks that you're going to have to know. And even if you don't have to know them, some of them we'll have to know for our tests. But they're people you're going to have to know for high school and college. So be familiar with them. All right, let's talk about this guy. His name was John Peter Zenger. This was happening over in the colonies. And the reason we care about him is because in our country, we value something called the freedom of the press, which is that the press, newspapers, magazines, online sources, they're allowed to print pretty much whatever they want. We would hope that most of it's true, but not all of it is. And in your little life, you are responsible for trying to figure out what's true and what's not. And we'll talk more about that later on this year too. But back in the colonial times, this was not a thing that was true. There was no freedom of the press. The press was an arm of the government. And so you better not speak out against the government. It was with this man and his trial that freedom of the press became something that was real for the colonies. There was a certain amount of freedom in the colonies because they were so far away from England. And so mostly some of these newspapers over in the colonies printed pretty much whatever they want. And there were newspapers everywhere, and let's remember, most people can read. So they liked their newspapers. They liked to read what was going on in places. And there were newspapers in most of the major cities. Newspapers carried political news, same as today. Some things never change. And they faced censorship by the government. In a lot of these colonies, as I said earlier, by the 1700s, a lot of the colonies that had started out as proprietary colonies, or however they had started, by the 1700s, many of them, the king had appointed a royal governor to many of them, regardless of how they had started out. They ended up having a royal governor. Sort of like we have governors today, except the governor was appointed. Well, the royal governor could do almost whatever he wanted. And some of these newspapers express a negative opinion about the royal governor. And John Peter Zenger had a newspaper that did that. And he accused the royal governor of New York of corruption because the man was corrupt. And the governor of New York said, oh, no, you will simply not do that. And Zenger said, but you are corrupt. And so the governor had him thrown in jail. Of course, it's going to go to a trial because the governor is corrupt and he'd like to just throw him in jail with no trial, but he can't really go that far because there's too many people watching. In his trial, Zenger and his lawyers argued that what he had said about the governor was true, that the man was corrupt, and that everyone knew it was true, and so he had the right to publish it. And he was found not guilty. And so this case establishes freedom of the press in our country. You can look at this case and say, aha, this is how we get here. And why do you think, well, okay, so who cares? Well, we do care. Because if you want to know why we have the ability and the freedom and the right to criticize people, and we have websites and we have WikiLeaks and we have all this stuff going on, we have this because it goes back to here. And so while you might not ever be, this might not be on a STAR test, it might not be on your college entrance exam, it's probably worth you knowing that it was this little guy criticizing the governor of New York, which gives us what we have today.